Mountain bikes are expensive, and we all want to get the most bang for our buck, but a lot of people don't know how to compare bikes to make the decision about which one to buy. The number one question I get on my channel and in emails is, which bike should I buy, bike A or bike B? And the two bikes they're often comparing are completely different and not even in the same ballpark. That's helped me realize that a lot of people don't really know how to compare bikes. So today I'm going to debunk some of the common but incorrect ways that people compare bikes. I've broken down common ways that people compare bikes into 6 phases. Now, you may not have followed these phases, but a lot of people do. And based on the questions I get and how they're phrased in comments, I can kind of tell which phase a lot of people are in when they're asking about bikes. Let's start with phase 1. Phase 1 is buying your first mountain bike. We all have to start somewhere, and usually we're either buying a friend's used bike or we're buying a bike from the bike shop that's closest to us. Proximity plays a huge part in that, and so does price. Most people aren't ready to drop $2,000 or $3,000 on their first mountain bike. That's a huge investment, especially if you're not quite hooked yet. So most of us buy whatever's close or cheap or convenient for our first bike. I've seen a lot of people in phase 1 get caught up in the emotion of it and just buy a bike right now because of the color or because they want one tomorrow and there's only one bike shop within 30 miles, and so they just go in and buy one. I always recommend doing a lot of research, test riding a few, and then picking the best one on that. But you know, when you're new, that's totally fine. You get a break, you get a pass, because at least you're getting into mountain biking and trying something. Phase 2, after people have had a bike for a little while, I think they like to boil everything down to these simple numbers. And the way that people in phase 2 boil down all bikes into one nice little number is the weight. Now, I'm not saying weight is not important, but novices at comparing bikes put weight as the number one priority. So while it is important to know what a bike weighs, it isn't the most important thing when comparing bikes, but you will see that it's a really easy way to boil down a lot of complex numbers into one nice whole number that you can compare. Bike A weighs this and bike B weighs this, therefore bike A must be better. Be careful not to do that. Phase 3 can be summed up in one word: carbon. These are the guys that when they tell you about their bike, they say, oh, I ride a Specialized stump jumper, carbon. Or I ride the Chameleon, carbon. And they have to make sure everyone knows that their bike is carbon, as if it legitimizes them more somehow. Carbon is a really cool material, and there's a lot you can do with it. I'm a fan of carbon, but carbon doesn't make something better. Just because a frame is carbon does not mean it's better than something that's not carbon. A lot of this comes on the heels of phase 2, which is all about weight, and carbon is typically lighter than aluminum, steel, or titanium for the same amount of material. It's also expensive, and people want to know, hey, I've got a bling bike and I want everyone to know it. And I guess I can understand that, but to me, mountain biking is not about showing off the bike I ride. It's about having fun with friends and letting the riding do the talking more than the bike. But you know, we've all fallen victim to this. I remember when I was growing up in the 90s, and when I saw a carbon mountain bike, man, I thought that thing was super exotic. It's like the Ferrari of mountain bikes. So it always makes me chuckle when the frames say carbon on them, or when someone's describing their bike and they say it's this model, carbon. Cool, that is what bike it is, and that's cool, but like, I don't know. To me, when I see a lot of that, it makes me realize that they think the material being carbon automatically makes it better than another material. And once again, that's an easy way to lump something into a category that may not be the best way to compare. Marketing rears its ugly head there and teaches us that carbon things are always better. A lot of times they are, but a lot of times they're not as well. It's like boiling down your future spouse based on what color jeans they wear, or what color their hair is. I mean, sure, you might have a preference of blondes over brunettes, but if that's your only criteria, you're not going to have a very happy marriage. There's so much more in the equation, and mountain bikes are the same way. Phase 4 for me was about travel. After I got through the weight and whether something was carbon or not, I started focusing on how much travel it has. And I still see this today. More travel must be better. And what more travel does is allows you to ride harder trails without changing your skill level at all. And that's great for a lot of people. It's like free skill. So when they compare bikes, they must think a 160, 170 bike is going to be better than a 120, 130 bike. And it really all depends. So every time someone asks me, is bike A better or bike B better? The answer is, it depends. What are you trying to do? How do you like to ride? Where do you ride? What's your riding skill? Are your trails steep? Are they smooth? Are they chunky? Do you prefer ups? Do you prefer downs? Are you riding flow all the time? And based on that input, then we can start to compare things. But this whole notion that more travel makes it a better bike or more aggressive bike or more capable bike, yes, it's more capable, but more travel is not always better. So I see a lot of people falling into that category as well. Next is phase 5, and this is where I see most of my viewers. And congratulations on making it this far, because a lot of people get stuck on phase 1, 2, and 3. Phase 5 is comparing components and group sets. It's when you have bike A and bike B, and this one has an NX derailleur and this one has a GX derailleur. So you say, I'm gonna buy bike B because it has better components for the same price. It's really cool that people are starting to learn the differences between group sets, between SX and NX and GX and X01 and XX1, and they're able to tell which ones are better. But once again, you're assuming everything else is completely identical between those bikes. And what really it comes down to is you think about a bike as a collection of components, not as a frame. The main problem with that is, A, most people blindfolded can't tell the difference between a GX and an XX1 derailleur. I'm sorry, you can't. You probably can in the shifters, but that's probably the least important part to compare, I would say, is derailleur. Sure, if the spec is grossly under-spec'd, yeah, you're right. We need to pay attention to that, but that should not be the primary thing that you're comparing when looking at bikes. Whether it's the Kashima fork or if it's the Performance Elite fork. Honestly, if that's the difference between bike A and bike B that you're comparing, you're overlooking something else. And once again, we're trying to boil it down to these even numbers that are just real easy to compare. I recommend looking at the components and comparing them, but don't make that your primary decision unless there's a huge discrepancy. So it is important to be able to compare components, and people in phase 5 are quite knowledgeable, but there's a little bit more knowledge that's even trickier to learn when you're comparing bikes, and that is in phase 6. In phase 6, you realize that what makes a bike unique is not the derailleur bolted onto it or the fork on it, it's the frame. You can change everything else on a bike except the frame. And that is the bones of the bike. And so that is the first place I go when comparing bikes, is I compare the frames. I don't even look at the components yet, because if the frame specs are not gonna interest me in a ride, I don't care if it's $1,000 off. It's the wrong bike for me. Now, comparing frames is very important on both hardtails and full suspensions. I will say it's even more important on full suspensions, because the way the rear suspension reacts is completely different from bike to bike. Even if the geo numbers are 100% identical, every bike has a different feel to it. Every full suspension bike has a different feel to it. They climb different, they descend different, they corner different, they pump different. And while there are charts and graphs to help you understand that, you really need to get out and ride those. Fortunately, hardtails are a little bit easier because we don't have to deal with the rear shock or suspension kinematics or anything like that. So we really can just boil it down to geometry, and frame material and frame design. So the question comes down to, if you could have a mediocre frame with the best parts or the best frame with mediocre parts, which would you choose? Everybody's different. I'm gonna go with the best frame with mediocre parts, because like I said, a GX derailleur is not gonna hold me back on being able to ride where I wanna ride, but a mediocre frame with the wrong geometry is definitely gonna be noticeable on every single ride. So start with geometry. Learn how to read geometry tables. Understand things like chainstay length, bottom bracket drop, reach, seat tube angle, effective top tube, head tube angle, stack. All of these things are super important to be able to know what they do. I don't have time to go into educating you on those right now, but a good bike comparer will be able to dig into that. And I'm proud of you. There are so many of you who are in category 6 who are looking at these things. You're looking at frame materials, you're looking at design, you're looking at all the frame geometry and specs and comparing that way. So when you get into group 6, you really start to realize what differentiates bike A from bike B is the frame, because every other part is bolt-on and you can swap anything else out down the road. So yeah, while you might get a 5% better value but on bike B versus bike A, make sure the frame is exactly what you want. I won't buy a bike if the frame is wrong, no matter what happens. If it's half off and the frame's not right, I'm not buying it, because that's the one thing you can't fix. One more thing I want to touch on is frame material. So just like the people in phase 2 that want to boil every bike down into a nice little weight number and compare that to make their decision, sometimes we do that in phase 6 as well, when we either choose a head tube angle and we stick just with that, or we worry about frame materials and we say steel is real, therefore steel is better than all other frame materials. It's not that easy, and we're definitely oversimplifying at that point, and 100 different steel frames will ride completely different, even if the geometry was identical from all of them. Same with carbon, same with aluminum, same with titanium. So be really careful about lumping things into these marketing cliches that just make it, you know, seem like, oh, I've ridden a steel bike, therefore I know what this other steel bike's gonna ride like. That does not help you. So once you've boiled it down to the bikes you want to ride, pick the top 2 or 3 and go ride them. Find someone who has one, go to a shop, go to a demo event. Nothing substitutes for riding a bike. And, you know, some of these bikes I get and I think, oh, this is going to be awesome based on the geometry tables, and I ride them and it's just not quite the right combination of geometry. Even though it looked great on paper, you ride it and you're just like, man, something's off and it just doesn't quite ride right. So anyway, those are the 6 phases of analyzing bikes and deciding if I should buy bike A or bike B. Coming soon, I'm going to show you how I compare them so you can learn some of the tricks and what I look for, etc. when I'm comparing bikes. I'm curious, which phase are you in? Do you agree with this information? Do you disagree? I hope I didn't offend anyone. All of the things that the phases look at are important, but one of them's not the more important than the others, where weight is the #1 decider, or price, or components, or frame material. So yeah, let me know, what else have you learned that helps you compare bikes? Post it in the comments below. Thanks for watching. There's a party in the mountains, and you're invited.